this was just a case of these incredibly knowledgeable women who were sort of speaking too much, or maybe they had to remain silent because they already knew what they were talking about, why would Paul say, if they have a question, they should go and ask their husbands at home? Like, it seems like a much more troublesome verse, for it is shameful for women to speak in church. Like, my solution to this, I don't think Paul wrote these words, especially given that, like you say, just a moment ago, Paul has said that women should cover their hair when they prophesy. Firstly, it's not necessarily the case. I suppose you could prophesy outside of a church, right? Like, it's not necessarily a contradiction. You could say, like, somebody's prophesying out on the street, and if you're going to do that, cover your hair. Right? That it doesn't say. I don't think Paul would be contradicting himself just to say that women shouldn't speak in church. Because when he says that women should cover their hair, it's specifically when they prophesy. It's not when they speak in church. It's when they prophesy, right? But it does seem like maybe he's being a bit contradictory here. Also, he's referencing the law. They should be in submission as the law also says, which is a very like un-Pauline thing to do. Paul is all about like Christ and grace, and the law is something, and yet here this appeal is being made to the law. So he seems to contradict himself, and he also seems to make a very un-Pauline, assertion. But also, this is the only verse in any of Paul's letters which in our earliest manuscripts moves around in the manuscript. Sometimes it's up here, sometimes it's down here in the earliest manuscripts. And so it's this weird thing where, and also if you read the text, Paul is talking about, like, Paul is speaking to the Corinthians about Corinthian matters, and he's talking about other stuff. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, is this verse. Women should be silent in the churches. If they've got anything to ask, they should go and ask it at home. And then it's right back to talking about to the Corinthians on a completely different subject matter. So it seems to me that Paul didn't write these words. These words found their way into Paul's letter, even though he never actually wrote them. And there's some interesting scholarship to suggest that that might be the case. What seems to have possibly happened here is that a scribe who's copying out Paul's letter sees him talking about like women prophesying and all of this kind of stuff. And so he writes in the margin his own note, like, yeah, but women should remain silent. It's a disgrace, they should go home and ask their husbands. And as these manuscripts get copied, it finds its way into the text, which is not an uncommon thing in the ancient world for that kind of thing to happen, for something to find its way into the text like that. That would also explain why it moves around. It would also explain why it contradicts something he said a moment ago. It would also explain why it's not very Pauline. And the funny thing is, he's probably saying that because he's read it in Timothy, even though arguably Paul didn't write the entire letter of Timothy, right? And so, in other words, my solution to this, my salvation of Paul here is just to say, well, he didn't write those words. And interestingly, that allows me to absolve Paul.